tweet storming and writing letters to your congressperson and phone calls and having these large demonstrations, it makes it impossible for them to ignore the reality of the climate crisis. On top of the consistent climate mega disasters that we just keep seeing prop up in the United States and all around the world. It's a growing and growing issue in terms of its importance and also in terms of political pressure.
Climate change. We've never faced a greater threat. Yet all that we produce and consume inflates the debt of greenhouse gases we release. We feel them raise the temp, and the tempest we'll unleash will leave us weeping to forget, unless we take collective action, make a pledge to finally change our ways and keep climate change in check, to benefit the planet and all of its inhabitants. We know it can be done, so listen up and join the quest.
And climate change demands that we change everything that we do.
Chad's Climate Quest is brought to you by Regen Intel, activating humanity to become a planet-positive species. Find out more at www.regenintel.earth.
On today's episode, we're welcoming Saad Amer. Saad is prominent environmental justice advocate and with over a decade of contributions to the global sustainability transition, consultant to the United Nations, and an expert reviewer for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC AR6 report. Saad has a diverse environmental portfolio. Notably, he secured significant funding for the national parks and co-created Harvard University Sustainability Plan. Beyond academia and advocacy, Saad co-founded Plus One Vote to amplify youth and BIPOC voter turnout. With collaborations spanning from Al Gore to Taylor Swift, his campaigns have left nationwide impact. A Harvard graduate, Saad's voice resonates in outlets like National Geographic, TEDx, and the United Nations, solidifying his position as a key influencer in the climate movement. Hi, Saad. It's great to have you on the show. Thank you for coming along my climate quest.
Excited to be here, Chad. You have a great podcast voice.
Thank you, Saad. I really appreciate it. I've been working on it my entire life.
All for this podcast.
So, Saad, I have to ask this question. I really do. How did you become so fabulous?
Well,
now for context, okay, so for context for my audience, why I'm asking this question, every single time I turn on social media, I see your face. Whether that's, pictures of you at a protest or posing at fashion galas, the cover of Vogue, sitting next to the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, as if you're like age-old friends. So how did you become so fabulous?
I feel like fabulous is a strong word, but I'm grateful to have that attributed to me.
You're pretty fabulous. I mean, not every climate activist gets on the cover of Vogue.
Well, I mean, with the Vogue feature, that was crazy. But I think that for me, part of my efforts in the climate movement are sometimes to make an impact in climate, you have to do things that seemingly have nothing to do with the climate, right? And I think one of the things that I have an issue with in the space is it feels like a lot of the times it's preaching to the choir. We have climate people talking to other climate people, and it just becomes this echo chamber. And I think through mediums like fashion, through sport, through business, through food, through all of these different mediums, we can reach people. Because to be able to reach people, right, I think we often talk about organizing as this thing where we all have to come together and do this new thing. And that's all fine. That's true a lot of the times. But people are already together. They already work together and live together. They eat together. They go out together. There are already groups that exist. So I felt like if we can tap into some of these spaces, then maybe those people will care about climate change too. And, I don't mind serving a good look from time to time as well. So, we have some fun while we're out here doing some climate work.
I mean, you really are serving, a good image for climate. And when I say fabulous, I know, you say it sounds like a strong word. I don't think it is. And I think it's really important to be fabulous. We need that. We need a little bit of fabulousness in the climate movement, in the environmental space, in sustainability. It's such a boring word, right? In the concept. And, we need a little bit of people like yourself. I'm not fabulous. I mean, look at me. I'm not going to go on the cover. I'm not going to have a Vogue feature. That much is clear. But we need people like you to do that because it creates a sense of glamour, of excitement in the work that we're actually doing, which is planet planetary grade work. We're really trying to save a lot of humanity from some of the most devastating consequences of our changing climate. And we need that fabulousness. We need that glamour. And I think you're serving that up. And we need more people like you to do that, to be that face and to do that. I mean, I actually think if we think about human behavior, we know humans respond to that little bit of glitter, the little bit of stardust, and they get excited about it. And that's how we engage. And I think that's what you're doing.
I mean, I think I'm here to serve some climate justice, but I'm going to serve a look too, you know? And
yeah, that's right.
yeah, that's right. And I think there's something that makes it more real and approachable. I think for decades we sort of had this like climate scientist image, you know, some dude in a lab coat or like some guy in a frumpy suit in Congress, and that's all fine. We need those people to be doing their things, but then you look at how siloed all those conversations are and how so many of those conversations are just talking to people within that world. And like, I don't come from that world. I don't have that background in the sense of like, I don't have a family in politics, you know, I don't like have some super privileged, like, you know, oh, like here's your welcome into Harvard, like here's your admissions scandal that just got you in the door. You know, I come from a low income background. My parents are immigrants from Pakistan. I don't see people who look like me or talk like me or act like me in any of these spaces. And I had a choice to sort of either I capitulate to the system and I become part of it, or I remain authentic to who I am and I try and transform it in whatever way I can. And in any efforts that I've made to like try and like redress who I am, I just got really bored. And I immediately found that I became boring, just like how the system is. And then I was also a part of the system and perpetuating it in exactly the way that it was. And so that didn't work for me. And so I had to make the active choice to just be myself and to try and just have that level of authenticity and faith within who I am. And I think that is maybe the fabulousness that you are resonating with. Not that I'm inherently fabulous, but by being inherently me, it's something that can come across as fabulous because other people can connect to it and relate to it too.
I think that's really spot on. And I think we all have an inner bit of fabulous that we need to release, you know? Exactly. And I think it's a really good thing. I think, you know, and I thank you also for sharing a little bit about your background and where you grew up and how you came into this from a different kind of perspective. And I just applaud you for the work that you're doing and being that kind of, you know, posing is the wrong word, authentically representing yourself in poses that get people excited on social media and so on. I think it's hugely important. And I want to know, though, from that background that you described, your parents must have had something to do with your inner fabulousness, your authenticity, your integrity as a human. What got you on your climate quest?
My climate quest started when I was a freshman in high school. And my biggest influence is, and to this day, is my high school bio teacher, Mr. Murray. I actually just saw him 2 days ago. He's the best person that you could ever hope to possibly meet. I had Mr. Murray for my first day of my first class ever of high school for bio. And we immediately clicked. We immediately just sort of got on with each other. And throughout high school, we would end up, my high school created this 100-acre land preserve on Long Island called the Fish Stick Land Preserve. And it came together by, you know, lobbying local officials and creating partnerships with Brookhaven National Laboratory out of the National Laboratory System of the Department of Energy, as well as working with our town, Brookhaven Town. And from there, me and Mr. Murray, we would go to the preserve all the time. We started an organization based around the preserve. I created a curriculum and then trained dozens of tour guides on that curriculum. Then we bussed out thousands of students from across New York to come to this preserve to learn, to kind of use it as a living laboratory and to learn about global warming and ecology and even what the Long Island ecosystem was like pre a lot of the development that it's undergone. And so for me, so much of my climate origin comes because of the influence of him as an educator who just
Wow.
really went out of his way, spent a lot of time and just went above and beyond and invested so much into our relationship and into being able to build something out really meaningfully.
And so it sounds like there's a level of mentorship that you had as a young age that kind of steering you and guiding you towards you on your quest,
Yeah,
right?
and I still
On
have
the
that.
quest you're on now.
Yeah, I still have that. I mean, I saw him like literally 2 days ago. I see him every couple months, and I think that
Every couple months you see him?
yeah, even to this day, I'm
That's
like
amazing.
well
Yeah.
graduated from high school, college, all that, just living my life. And I have an immense amount of gratitude. And as a mentor, he's done so much to sort of shape my perspective and open doors that I didn't even know were closed in my face, and
Mm-hmm.
learning that from a young age and kind of infiltrating the system, and
Mm-hmm.
having to figure out, like, in a lot of those spaces that's where I had to learn how to represent myself, because it would be like, I'd be at Brookhaven National Labs and it would be like these old PhD scientist people. And how could I, as like, I don't know, a 14-year-old random brown kid from Long Island,
Mm-hmm.
relate to these people? But I had to, and I had to figure it out, and I had to learn how to work with them. And I would go on to, do scientific research projects with Brookhaven National Labs, BNL, and at BNL, I ended up working at the National Synchrotron Light Source, which is like this multi-billion-dollar particle accelerator, and was using it in high school to measure and examine contaminants in the Long Island ecosystem. And some of those projects ended up winning medals from like NOAA and other organizations. And I credit a lot of that door opening to
Mm.
sort of mentorship and guidance that I had from Mr. Murray, but also the community support that I had. I think when the preserve was being created and we were developing all these programs, no one had really done anything like that. And it was well before the sort of climate activist era that we're in right now, where
Yeah.
while there is a
Mm-hmm.
lot of opposition, there is also a lot of faculty support for students to skip school on Fridays and more green clubs and things like that. But we sort of just went for it and created these unconventional things. And I think that is maybe why I'm a bit unconventional in my approach to trying to solve the climate crisis.
Oh, well. I mean, I think it's great that you have this experience growing up with this mentor, and it really just highlights the need for this intergenerational connection. And I'm sure there's also mutual mentorship that's happening as you have also come onto the climate space, how you're influencing your community who have supported you, and vice versa. But when we first met, I want to talk a little bit about activism. When we first met, at the time 100 most influential people ceremony. And everybody listening, stay tuned. I mean, this guy might be one of them soon. I'll tell you what. But you first introduced yourself as an activist. That was the first thing you said to me. Is that how you see yourself? Is activism your superpower?
I think I introduce myself as a climate activist because I think it is the closest term that comes to describing what I do. But I
Mm.
also think the idea of activism has expanded so much in the last few years, and that I could choose some of the other titles in, academia or in business or finance or my consultancy or all these other things that I work on. But I think an activist is someone who unrelentingly will continue to fight to change the system.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the common theme throughout all my life and all my work. And so I very intentionally stick to the label of activist because I think it describes what I do, and it describes the level of gravity that I see the system in terms of how it needs to change. And I'm not just advocating for change. I'm not just, hoping for small little things here and there. We need a full transition. We need a full climate revolution. And so as an activist, I fight for that every single day.
I love that. Yeah. I think I was just going to ask, at what point do you move from activist to revolutionary? And you say climate revolution, and I'm often a fan of hashtag regenerative revolution. We really need to fundamentally change the system. But I'm curious, like where's that line from activism to revolutionary?
I think, well, I feel like we're heading towards a climate revolution in some
Mm-hmm.
ways. I mean, I think we've already gone through, in a sense, the climate crisis itself is a revolution, but a bad one,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like we have actively introduced ourselves into a revolution in, falling global supply chains and
Mm-hmm.
famine and climate refugees and extinction and, in the Anthropocene, one might call it. But in a way, it's a revolution, just a bad one. We need the opposite of that to solve it. And so, as we have all these activists organizing and marching and protesting, I'm interested to see how our global culture will develop as we head towards 2030, 2050, as we start to see, even in a scenario where we limit our warming to 2 degrees, we will still see an estimated 200 million climate refugees. And I've seen some measures that even go all the way up to a billion climate refugees.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in a context of such vast global migration, everything will change. We will see, I mean, even the few thousand, few is maybe not the best word, but even from the thousands of refugees that we saw coming out of Syria, and how the instability and homophobia and Islamophobia and bigotry that we saw coming as a result of that, with
Mm-hmm.
those populations moving from Syria into Europe, what will happen when that's on the scale of hundreds of millions of people? Everything will change. And
Yeah.
so I think we have to reframe a lot of these conversations. Everything will be a revolution. And when we look at climate migration specifically, I think we often look at migration as a threat to our individual privilege, as a threat to our ability to exist in the society that we know. But when those migration patterns are only happening because of that same privilege, when those people are climate refugees, then I think we have to reframe that conversation significantly and see migration as a climate solution, not as a.
Mm-hmm. And that reframing is really fundamental. And I think I want to challenge you on a little bit of one thing you said. You said, this will change everything. I think it already has.
Yeah.
It already has changed everything. I mean, Naomi Klein, one of my great great thinkers in this space, when she wrote that book, this changes everything. And it does. Climate change has already changed everything. It's already built into the system. I think you're so accurate to point out that even if we stopped emissions today, we would still have built-in climate change, and we would still have to deal with catastrophic events that are on the horizon, refugees, forced migrations, climate migration being one of them. And so we have to think about this as, not just how we stop emissions as soon as possible, yes, and how do we prepare our culture, our economy, our society, our way of thinking to see this as an opportunity? And this is kind of what this podcast is really all about, to identify, well, since this does change everything, since we have to change, how do we do this in a way that creates something that we actually want? And so flipping that narrative, flipping that, that reframing that is it's an opportunity that comes at a terrible, terrible cost. But it's the only time in human history that we've had this opportunity where we have to change everything. So let's do it right. But a lot of people also seem to denigrate activism as futile, ineffective, not a real solution. They cast revolutionaries out as someone's completely out of reality. They're not actually going. We can't change everything. This isn't going to change everything. This isn't going to be a revolution. I personally think that's ridiculous. But how do you counter that narrative? What fuels you to be that activist and see that as a pathway to make real change? Like, what are some success stories that you've had and ones that you want to have as you continue in this journey?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think the way things were going over the past several decades on climate, if the science was enough, it would have worked, right? If the policymakers were competent enough, they would have fixed it. And they didn't. And so here we are having to make noise and change the way the conversation is being had. I think if we look back to past revolutionaries, Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, they were incredibly hated at their time, right? Like we look back and we see them as heroes for a lot of the things that they caused in our society, but Martin Luther King Jr. was literally shot, right? And so I think that we often forget the fact that these revolutionaries are some of the most hated people of their times. And being a climate activist or even a climate scientist, you inherently have just this massive base of people that are going to hate you and just disagree with you and not like you. But to be honest, as like a South Asian, Muslim, brown, whatever person growing up in America, I already had that, right? Like I was already not going to win over everybody. And in many ways I never will win over everybody. But you don't need everybody to make change. You just need to gather enough people to reach that critical cultural tipping point, and then things can change. And when I look at the modern climate movement and all of the incredible activists doing their work, they have fundamentally reshaped the conversation. I mean, I remember growing up and it was like, who's this weird brown kid in the forest? Like, is this that guy from the Jungle Book? And now they're like, oh, is that Aladdin? Which I think is a little bit more fabulous,
A little bit more fabulous, flying on that carpet.
It's a whole new world. Um, but I think that the reality is that because of this massive wave of activism, things have changed a lot. And I think right now we're in this sort of era of movements: the climate movement, the March for Science, the March for Black Lives, Stop Asian Hate, the Women's March. All these things have been propping up over the last few years, and I think are continuing to move forward. We are continuing to mobilize these movements, and they're continuing to have momentum. It's because people want change. And that change is so clear in so many ways, all the injustices that these different groups are facing, all the injustices that we're seeing arise as a result of the climate crisis, that it's becoming more and more blatant. And the activism component, while some people might be against it, even within the climate space,
That's true. Yeah.
it is, to be honest, the only reason a podcast like this can exist. It is the only reason why I just came from giving a talk at the New York Times. It is the only reason they have a vertical on climate now. The level of activism and sustained interest that people have proven exists in climate, especially the young activists, have fundamentally transformed how all sorts of political candidates, celebrities, sports figures, everyone is talking about this issue now. And so people might be like, oh, like, what has the movement really achieved? Well, I don't know. Biden just announced a major climate jobs corps, which is directly an idea of the Sunrise Movement. We have the Inflation Reduction Act, which, while it doesn't solve anything, is in many ways a reflection of the Green New Deal. So many of these things can directly be linked back to activism on the ground. And so I do believe that the activism is making a fundamental impact and is radically transforming our society already.
I couldn't agree with you more, frankly. But one thing I'm a little bit worried about, I'm going to be honest. You mentioned this concept of like, people often hate those revolutionaries, hate those people who are, pouring their lifeblood, their energy, their spirit into making these kinds of transformations to the system, because people fear it. And what I worry about, and you also mentioned this, the importance of young activists in this fight and in this movement for change. And I think it isn't a generational thing. I think there's going to come a time when these issues are not even going to be issues anymore, because the older generations who are preventing change are going to pass on. They're going to move on. And the next generations are coming up with that same energy that you've talked about. And it's a matter of time. And that also is a bit of fear in those folks who say, no, activism is not working. It's ineffective in trying to prevent that. But what I'm also worried about is the health and well-being of younger activists, that they have this burden placed upon them. And you see it everywhere. And it's this rise of young activism. And I've been with them the whole way. I've been working with and in some ways mentoring some, whether that's Shea Bastida, Alexandra Villaseñor, Jerome Foster, Isaias Hernandez, Christy Drutman, Clover, Hogan, you. And I can't forget Lily Platt from the Netherlands. She's an amazing young activist. Stood on the corner with her in Amsterdam. But what I worry about is that I have so much respect for that energy and work that goes into being on stage, on the streets, communicating these incredibly challenging issues and concepts that take their toll on me every day. I've been in this business for 15 years. I mean, I feel that every single day. To do that in a way to so many different audiences, that's so wide and diverse audiences, and to know that there's that hate, that dismissal that comes along with that, I really worry about the toll that it's taking on younger activists, about their development, their futures, how they can be taking care of themselves. And one of the things I really want to ask you, Saad, because having the time that I have known you, I find that you create that fabulousness, right? And like, I wonder, what are those tips that you have for young activists to be fabulous in what they do and how they take care of themselves? Because it's really important that this generation does that.
I mean, I started my work when I was like 12 or 13, and this is like way pre-climate movement. I've similarly been in this space for like 15 years at this point. And, at the time, there was no climate movement. There was no, in the way that it exists now, it wasn't a cultural thing. You couldn't be a climate activist. It wasn't a thing at that time. And one thing I'll say is, now with this rise of activism, I think amongst activists, there is so much support and community building. So like literally every single person that you just mentioned, I know them all. We'll like hang out sometimes. We'll like support each other's projects. We'll help each other in whatever ways that we can, because we know that we're all fighting the same fight. And so I think there is that sense of community. And that is really important in the space. It's to make sure you have a sense of community. It's also knowing that because you have that community, you don't have to be sprinting the whole time, right? Like it's a bit of a relay, and maybe you don't know exactly who you're passing the baton to, but if you need to take a time out and just sit on the bleachers, you need to know that there's somebody else running too. And so it is about going hard when you can go hard, and just sitting on the side and taking a break when you need to. Otherwise, you're just going to constantly deal with burnout. And the planet is already burning out. We don't need our activists to be experiencing that same phenomenon.
I think it's true for activists, scientists, implementers across the board. But thank you for that. I really appreciate that. Community. Absolutely. I want to switch gears a little bit, because I think your role as an activist is so important. Bringing that, I know I keep saying this. I know you feel maybe a little embarrassed by saying, I'll just say glamour, a little glamour into it. I think it's really
same thing. Glamour is fabulous. I'm like, me?
I mean, Saad. I mean, seriously. I mean, check out your social. You should look at your own social media profile. I mean, there's like a twinkle of stardust every time I see you, a picture of you. It's great. But one of the things that I think really drew me to you when I first met you is that, while you introduced yourself as like an activist to start with, like almost immediately we started talking models, like quantitative models. And so you have this like really extensive grounding in the science behind climate solutions, these sustainability challenges, and all these sustainability challenges that we're facing today. You're grounded in the science. You're able to talk shop with me. I mean, with any of us who are working on like these complicated systems models. I mean, we're data junkies here, and I love that you have that sort of other side to you. And not that those have to be distinct, but you, just as an example, as we pointed out earlier, you're an expert reviewer for the IPCC AR6 report. That's no small feat. I mean, so it's really interesting to see that scientific side alongside the activism. And I'm curious about how you weave that in. How do you weave in the science of climate solutions into your activism work? Or do you see these as really like two sides of Saad?
I think they're all the same conversation. It's just a different approach to how you tell the same story. And, when I love data. Give me a report. I want to just dig right in, get into the graphs, get into the nitty gritty, and see what the reality actually is, what the climate solutions, what the climate impacts, what the models are actually telling us. And from that, when I'm more informed, I can tell a better story. I can tell a more accurate story. I can help people connect with that reality even better. I mean, literally 2 weeks ago, I just co-authored a study that just came out of Yale, the YPCC, the Yale program on climate change communication. I'm sure you know their climate change in the American mind studies that they do. Maybe you
Absolutely. Yeah.
don't. I don't know. You're like, what?
No, no, no. I was on their podcast once, twice. For years. So, yeah,
Podcast host.
I know them.
Exactly. And so, we just did an edition of the Climate Change in the American Mind study that is environmental justice in the American mind, and really looking at, I mean, we surveyed 1,000 Americans on their attitudes and behaviors specifically on environmental justice. And so much of that, and my input on that, was focusing specifically on democracy and looking at people's behaviors in response to environmental justice messaging and storytelling. And by having this data now, I and other organizers can more well create campaigns and tell stories to get people to connect to climate justice, to understand why people aren't connecting to climate justice. And to me, what is perhaps the most important is to electoralize the notion of climate justice and environmentalism and help draw people to the polls. Because I think that voting is one of the biggest climate justice solutions.
Well, I mean, that brings, of course, to your organization that you launched, Plus One Vote. And it seems like this is an organization helping, as you say, bring younger generations and BIPOC communities to vote. And this is such an important piece of the solution. How do we get our voices heard and have our politicians actually respond? Have you seen substantial changes in voter turnout in the districts that you're active in? And actually, maybe before that, why don't we start just like set the stage? Describe Plus One Vote. What does it do? How does it get out to these communities? And then what are some substantial changes that you've seen in voter turnout?
Sure. So one thing I should say is I co-founded Plus One Vote in 2018. I took a step back from the organization last year. But the work of Plus One Vote is so much about mobilizing young people and people of color to get out and vote on issues like climate change, social justice, voting rights. When I look at so many of the movements that we have right now and the vast interest that I see across young people, what I find oftentimes is that we fail to connect and educate these communities to how they can actually take action, right? Like when I look at the environmental movement, it's all like plastic straws and like reusable water bottles and like, do you compost and stuff like that? And like, that's all fine and good. Like you should certainly do those things. But those solutions, like if everybody did them, then it would maybe make a dent. But when it comes to our voting behavior, if we could get even a fraction of people to do that, that would change everything. We wouldn't have to worry about plastic straws because we could just outlaw them. And so when I think about how we can make these larger systemic changes happen, so much of my lens is through democracy. And so much of the solution that I advocate for is for people to not only vote, but to bring other people with them to vote. I think there's often this assumption that your smart friends, your woke friends, your educated friends, they're all voting. And that just isn't the case. When you look at a presidential election, less than half of youth voters, those 18 to 29, show up and vote. The same is true for a midterm election. It's less than a third, actually. And so when you look at the discrepancy between how we think young people are thinking about these issues and what the numbers are at the polls, you realize we really need to make a better effort to connect these young people to get out and vote. And I think with the modern climate movement, because it is so youth fueled, there's an immense opportunity to get young people out and vote. And actually, one statistic out of that Yale study that we just published is that 1 in 4 registered voters are participating or willing to participate in a campaign to convince elected officials to take action to advance climate justice. That's major, especially considering that only about 1% of people are actively participating in those campaigns. And so there's such potential for growth to further mobilize people in these campaigns and to get them out and vote. And I think that if we can root it all in science, if we can root it all in the social realities that we're experiencing as a result of the climate change, we get everyone out to the polls. We have this sort of bottom up pressure to then force these top down leaders to change everything. We hit everybody in the middle, and then we have a climate revolution.
Yes, yes, you're speaking my language, Saad. I love this. I love this. I'm really happy that you're saying this. I mean, I'm a little surprised because I wasn't expecting you to say it this way. I really, really appreciate that. Something that I've often, for quite a long time now, been trying to say in very similar ways. We do need bottom up action in order to incentivize and to force the hand of top-down regulations. But the most important thing is the middle out, or the institutions, institutional transformation that needs to happen. And, at Drawdown, my previous organization, which I founded, we did a lot of work identifying all the technologies, all the practices that can stop global warming and begin the process of reversing it.
Some brilliant work, by the way.
Oh, I appreciate that so much. I appreciate that. But one of the things that I didn't include in the framework were things like voting or behavioral changes like that were just a little too hard to quantify exactly the direct impact. And so it doesn't fit into the quantitative models. You can't really add voter turnout. You can't really add that into the equation as much. So what we focused on was just the technologies and the practices, and we certainly organize them based on what we call level of agency. So what individuals and households can do, businesses could do, utilities, et cetera, et cetera. The point is we cut out with this list of individual actions these are the things that you could implement, technologies, practices that whether that's reducing your food waste or plant-rich diets or heat pumps in your homes, et cetera. But it only made a dent. And this is where I think your point is so valid. Like, we get into this dialogue around individual action versus collective action around, is it the consumers who are the cause of this, or is it the institutions, the businesses, the producers, or is government's role to do this? And I think you're touching upon something that's just so important, is that yes, and like, yeah, we can make a dent if we did all that, all those solutions. It could be substantial. But at the end of the day, producers produce emissions, and government allows those institutions to produce emissions and to produce things in certain ways, and has the capacity to change that. So where does the power actually lie to make change? I think you just said it right there. That solution that we weren't able to quantify in Drawdown, for example, but has the most potential as a solution that for individuals, and as you point out, communities, because it's really about those communities coming together and saying we want change and reinforcing that. So I just want to applaud you for making that distinction between those specific solutions and like technologies and practices, and then of course this more powerful community action. Do you see this as happening in the U.S. though?
That's a good question. And I think that when it comes to looking at all of these systems, bottom up, top down, and I've spent a lot of time personally just evaluating and reevaluating my own frameworks for how I spend my time and what I dedicate my efforts into, in terms of, we all have a limited amount of time, but so many things need to change. And, when I just saw you a couple of weeks ago at the March to End Fossil Fuels. Thank you for showing up. And I hope all the people listening here are showing up to our marches and organizing and striking, because it's a critical component. The March to End Fossil Fuels, 2 days prior to it, I met with the Secretary General of the United Nations, and it was me and some other incredible young leaders talking to him about the realities of the climate crisis and very directly asking him for a specific set of solutions. And he was very much on board. The Secretary General of the United Nations is very much aware of the reality of the climate crisis, called the Climate Summit during Climate Week because of his reality, his awareness of how dire this issue is and how little action is actually happening. And so, we had this meeting, literally like the head of the world in some ways, And then 2 days later, right, like he's the head of the United Nations, like,
Yeah.
and then 2 days later, I showed up with 75,000 of my best friends to his front door to ask for stronger
Yeah.
action. And it doesn't get much more bottom up and top down, but you're right in that all these institutions in the middle, national actors, state actors, city actors, local actors, are not anywhere near the pace that they need to be at. And so when I look at the United States specifically and how this country likes to frame itself as a leader in the global conversation on climate, and how so many countries uh, follow and take the US as a leader in this space, I grow worried, because if this is what leadership is looking like, then oh God, there's so much
Scary.
more left to be desired. And I do recognize that this administration has put forward things like the Inflation Reduction Act, the single biggest climate policy ever, the largest investment we've ever seen. And that's great. Applause for that. But it doesn't go far enough. And we know that even if we were to do everything within the bill, it would only get us to about a 40% reduction in carbon. And that's
Yeah.
not at all where we need to be. And so I think that for that reason, we need to continue building up that political pressure. And that's why that bottom up force is so important, because I think for politicians to act, you have to create the political will for them to act. Otherwise, they'll just act in accordance to whoever is bribing and lobbying them. And so, while that reality
Yeah.
is unfortunate, by having these massive mobilizations, by lobbying our congresspeople, by tweet storming and writing letters to your congressperson and phone calls and having these large demonstrations, it makes it impossible for them to ignore the reality of the climate crisis. On top of the consistent climate mega disasters that we just keep seeing prop up in the United States and all around the world. It's a growing and growing issue in terms of its importance, and also in terms of political pressure. And so I think as we head into this major 2024 election, it's going to continue to be this growing, mobilizing, organizing force. And I am happy to see how many activists are taking command on that, and I'm happy to see
Mm-hmm.
that things are at some level changing. It isn't as much as we need, but it's a lot more than we could have hoped for when we started our careers.
I think that's right. I totally think that's right. And, part of, I think what the challenge is, and I am glad that you're calling out the IRA, because it is the most ambitious climate piece of legislation, and yet it falls far short. And the way it is constructed leaves a lot of room for uncertainty about the actual implementation of solutions. Let's be real. 40% if we're lucky, and we actually do all that. But I also think part of the challenge is that we're not actually naming the marker on the horizon to the place we actually want to be. So we've been working at Regenerative Intelligence, the company I launched, with a community-wide organization, multiple different community organizations coming together, called the Earth Bill. And they presented it in Congress, or Representative Espaillat from New York introduced it to Congress just in December and earlier this year, in January 2023. It's the most ambitious bill ever proposed to any national legislature that I know of. And what we did at Regenerative is actually did the quantitative analysis. What will this bill accomplish? And if this bill gets passed, which, this is where we need, this is the actual thing we need, we would actually achieve the U.S. contribution, its estimated contribution to achieve the Paris Agreement, to be on track for 1.5 degrees Celsius warming target. Now, reason I bring this up is that's the kind of bill that we need, and a rallying cry for activists like yourself and so many others to rally behind what we actually want, not short measures, not things that are going to take us partially the way there, but what are the things that we actually need to do? 100% clean renewable energy that's sourced and sited correctly and rightly, and not disturbing and disrupting or infringing upon indigenous land rights in different parts of the world, etc. We need 100% electric vehicles. We need 100% regenerative agriculture. We need these to be mandated. Now, will this actually pass Congress? I don't think so, Saad. To be
Not
honest, I
with
don't
that
think the political
attitude,
will.
Chad. Not with that
Well,
attitude.
I think it's going to take some time.
Yeah.
You're going to take some. And my colleagues have been maybe upset that I just said that. But to be honest, it needs to be the rallying cry, and I think that's what's kind of missing in the space is from a scientific background. What is the goal that the United States actually has to achieve? What is that? To get on track to the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming target. And if we don't have that, everything we do is going to be a short measure. And everything we do to get closer to that actual target is going to be a win.
Yeah, I mean, you're describing one of the things that bothers me so much about our society and our political system is that our politicians are working on 2, 4, 6 year election cycles. That's how they think, that's how they fundraise, that's how they operate. And there is very little incentive for them to do something good for people 10 years down the line. There's like, what do they get out of it if they actually fix an issue that's going to impact people in 30 years? Like, unfortunately, they're not thinking about their legacies in that sense. They're thinking about their immediate approval ratings. They're thinking about their immediate ability to get reelected to whatever next political position. And so what you get is a series of these like disjointed, piecemealed efforts that have left communities of color facing so many climate injustices and other social injustices. You get a gun lobby that is running this entire country and our fundamental inability to help our education system as children hide in the corners trying to avoid being shot from shooters. And you get a series of broken and non-cohesive climate measures that just get pitched and cap and trade and carbon tax and whatever over the years that don't even get implemented. And by the time it's even time to have those conversations about implementation, it's so irrelevant because the world is so much worse than when those plans were designed. And so what we need, in addition to this sort of increased political participation, is just better leaders who are willing to take bigger risks and make real investments in this country and across the world to actually fix our system. Because the reality of it is, if they don't, the fossil fuel industry is making the same investments to make things worse. And we will continue to see those things get worse unless we actively start to counteract them right now.
Here. Exactly. And part of it's like, how do you find those leaders? Where are those leaders?
It's you, Chad.
It's hard to find. It's you, Saad.
Right
it's you.
Here.
It's you. No, let's run for office together, okay?
Oh God.
I'll be your running mate. I want to be your running mate.
Okay.
But I'm actually concerned. If it can't be done in the United States, even more importantly, if it can't be done in California or New York or San Francisco or like entities where we have a lot of political will for implementing solutions, where we have the money to do so, where these are the centers of our economy, and it's still not actually being done there. We need those models first and foremost. But I'm concerned if we can't get this done and create these models of action in the United States, where are we going to turn? How do we expect other countries in the world to be following suit, particularly the high emitting countries? I mean, EU is definitely, in my opinion, far more advanced. We're going to see huge transformation with the Green Deal when those regulations come into force in a few years' time. There's going to be massive disturbance in the system and in a good way. But I'm a little concerned. Like, how can we expect the rest of the world to be picking up the burden when a place like the United States can't even get it done, even at scale?
It's a good question. And it's one of the things that worries me a lot is this sort of notion of global collaboration, because that's what's necessary. But we've done it before. I mean, I look at something like the Montreal Protocol, and like that, it was like science solution done. And people are like, what happened to that hole in the ozone layer? I guess it was a hoax. It's like, no, we literally fixed the issue. So it's not a hoax, we fixed it. And that's how I hope we remember the climate crisis, is that like, oh, that climate change thing, that never happened. You all are crazy. It's like, I hope people think that, because now is the time where we have to actually fix and change it before, now is the time where we have to be able to correct it, And so when I look at the role of governments across the world, there is a need for multilateral cooperation. But also, when I look at something like the Paris Agreement, and how that is, over 190 member states of the United Nations signed on to the Paris Accord, uh, it's non-binding, right? And so at the end of the day, every single nation that has signed onto it has to take those actions itself. It's not about necessarily whether the US is doing it or not. Every one of those countries ought to do it as part of this global cooperative thing. And it is a shame that so many countries are not actually taking enough action. Even at the Secretary General's climate summit during Climate Week, the United States was not granted a speaking slot because it didn't actually ramp up its ambition. And I was there, and John Kerry was denied the opportunity to speak at the summit. He was literally there on the floor and denied the opportunity to speak because the United States did not ramp up its climate ambitions to the level necessary to be granted a slot. And so you look at that, but then you also look at the reality of, seeing someone like Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of the Barbados, and how drastically she's taking climate action within her country because her people have no other choice, right? Like, we're already seeing that land being eviscerated as a result of sea level rise and all sorts of other climate related disasters. And so there is a major global incentive to take action from many of these countries. But what we also need is these major high emitting oil producing countries like the United States to actually take a look in the mirror and to actually take that action internally and to stop investing in fossil fuels
immediately. I mean, this has got to be immediate action. Can't we be waiting any longer? As we talked about earlier, like the built-in climate, the change to climate, and it's already into the system, and we're only going to be making it worse. We need to stop it immediately. And this is why I think also your reference to Barbados and other smaller countries, I think, is actually really important and really key. And I kind of refer to this as well when I think about California, New York, where they're sort of more pro climate solutions, economy oriented thinking. I believe that in order to make the kind of change that you're talking about, we need to have examples of it, models. It doesn't exist. There's not a single place that I can point to anywhere in the world, really. I mean, there are certain countries that I think, can do that. There are a few, Costa Rica, Suriname, and others.
I hosted this panel event with the Costa Rica and UNEP and UNDP and WWF and the ambassador to Costa Rica. And never in all my climate career have I seen like a political figure walk into a climate debate and a climate panel, whatever, with such ease. Like, he's just in there like, there's nothing to criticize me for. My country, over 95% renewable energy. Solar, we got it. Wind, galore. Hydro, geothermal, we're doing it. We're working on restoration and conservation. I've never seen that like level of ease. And it was actually really refreshing to see someone who went in and was like, yeah, I did the work. Why can't you?
Why can't you? Yeah, that's right. And we need more of those. We need more of those. And I think we need those jurisdictions that actually have the capacity to do that, where it's, manageable at the municipal scale, state scale in the United States, or provincial scale in different countries, or smaller countries and small island developing states really have an opportunity to show the world, what can be achieved. What does a regenerative economy actually look like? Well, let's find a model of that and try to work with, state actors that can actually make that transformation and show the world what can be in the possibility of that. So I think that's one key piece. Now, you mentioned the United Nations. Okay, I used to work for the United Nations myself, different agencies there, parts of the United Nations, and as a consultant, and I have a lot of respect for the United Nations. Is this the institution for real change?
It's a good question. I think the United Nations has its purpose. And one of the biggest contributions that the United Nations has to the world is that it is the only entity that brings together all the countries to the table to have a conversation. It's the only place that exists that does that. And in that regard, that's really amazing. Now, when they have those conversations is where things start to break down. And you would hope that if you were to bring what are presumably the most intelligent, like elected or appointed or whatever leaders from all around the world, and you put them in a room and you're like, hey, here's a problem, that they could solve it. And obviously they haven't. Like I think about the sustainable development goals, and whether it's to end hunger or no more poverty, or working with life on land, underwater, no more war, climate action, and just our complete inability to fix those issues. It can be really heartbreaking and devastating, really, for what that actually means for people in the world. And so I think the United Nations has its role, but it is not the entity that can, with a magic wand, fix everything. And that's what I've learned from being there on the inside, working there. It still takes national actors. It still takes grassroots momentum. It still takes all of these different institutions to come to the table and take action. And if it was as easy as like, hey, bro, like sign this resolution, I think it would have been done already. But obviously that's not the case. And so there is a continued need for all of these other institutions, whether they be NGOs or nonprofits or businesses or education systems or whatever, to all play their role in fixing these larger systemic issues. Because when you think about it, the system is composed of us. And so if we all change and we all change it, the system changes too.
That really resonates. Thank you, Saad. Now, I want to be respectful of time because we're running out of time, unfortunately. I could really speak to you for much longer, for hours. But I always ask my guests one final question. So here we go. You have a little bit of time left for this. What is your vision for a regenerative future? What's the marker on the horizon for Saad Amer? And what's your role in achieving it?
I think that the one single thing that I am waiting for more than anything is when our sustained global collaboration actually gets our emissions to go down. And once we enter that trajectory, and if we can sustain that, then we can actually solve this crisis. But until we get to that point, I'm going to continue to work like hell. I mean, even when we get to that point, I'm going to still have to work like hell, and I'm sure you will too, and everybody listening to this. But that to me is the single biggest thing, is we actually need to reduce our emissions. And so to me, that's what the future looks like. That's the starting point of what that future looks like. And ultimately, what we need is a just transition. We need a transition where we are actively prioritizing the realities and needs of young people, of people of color, of the indigenous, of Black people, of all these separate communities, highlighting them and the impacts on them, and preventing them from suffering these immeasurable, awful, awful things. And I think that if we continue to operate with a climate justice lens, we can get to that future.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Saad. I agree with you again. I think we're definitely on the same wavelength here. And I only hope that when we are reducing those emissions with solutions, we think about the many cascading benefits those solutions have to these other challenges that we're facing, because we can multi-solve. Yeah. Sometimes the same set of solutions, when done right, with justice, equity, and inclusion at the core of that system, we can solve for many of the things we're facing today. But thank you, Saad, for joining me today on my climate quest. We've learned a lot about your inspiring story, and I'm sure listeners like me are going to be really excited to take that energy with us throughout the year, and that little spark of fabulousness that you bring to the space. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm thrilled to welcome you on my climate quest.
This podcast is brought to you by Regen Intel, a public benefit advisory and education platform training the next generation of leadership for a better planet, and co-produced and distributed by our incredible partners, Better Worlds, Source Studios, and Shortcomings. Special thanks to Michael Katijian, aka Inverse K, for the incredible intro number for Season 3 of this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others. And to learn more about Regen Intel, check out our Foundations program at www.regenintel.earth/education. Applications are accepted all year round. See you next time on Chad's Climate Quest.